Brilliant. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I'm just going to turn my camera off and hopefully everybody can see the screen.
We can, yes.
And is it working? Just bear with me 1 second. I was in and out. Yes. Okay. Perfect. Okay. Super stuff. Thank you very much for allowing me to talk about risk assessments and British Standard 8580 version 1, devised in 2019. And I suppose why I'm talking to you about risk assessments. I've had 26 years in the water hygiene, water treatment industry, and a lot of different types of risk assessments have come my way, and I've witnessed a few good ones and a few not so good ones. And I suppose the risk assessment really is the basic, the fundamental building block of creating a plan, a management plan, a written scheme, a water safety plan, and it's the fundamental basis of what you make your future decisions on. And this information is quite key in regards to getting it right, making sure that we've got the right things in place, making sure that we are doing the right things. And there's a lot of organisations out there that can deliver risk assessments. And as I mentioned, of some good quality, some not so good quality. But one of the things that we strive at the Water Hygiene Centre is a UCAS accredited risk assessment, which means that it conforms to British Standard 8580. And we are one of only 14 companies that are accredited to deliver UCAS risk assessments, which comply with the 8580 document. And what we're going to talk about today is Legionella risk assessments. Why are they needed? British Standard 8580, what does it include? And do your risk assessments comply? And key points to take away. So there's a couple of slides in this document or in this presentation deck that are quite key for you to go back and revisit and maybe just take a good look at to see whether you actually conform to them or not. And why are they needed? Okay, so the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations. Yeah, just bear with me 1 second while I just move. Yes. Okay, cool. Okay, the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations 1999 require employers to put in place arrangements to control health and safety risks. And as a minimum, you should have the processes and procedures required to meet the legal requirements, which includes a written policy, an assessment of the risks to employees, contractors, customers, partners, and any other people who could be affected by your activities. And we've got to record the significant findings in writing if you employ 5 or more people. Any risk assessment must be suitable and sufficient. And the arrangement for the effective planning, organisation, control, the monitoring and review of the preventative and protective measures that come from the risk assessments. We've got to have access to competent help. And that competent help could be from within his or her own organisation, or it could be from a contractor, consultant, or experienced risk assessor. We're meant to provide employees with information about the risks in the workplace and how they are protected. We're meant to give instruction, training for employees in how to deal with the risks. And we're meant to ensure that there is adequate and appropriate supervision in place, consulting with employees about their risks at work and current preventative and protective measures. Now, I've just said really what this means. So this is the basics for your business: getting help where we need, risk assess, consult the workers, first aid in work, display the law poster, the law from a health and safety executive, health and safety at work Act 1974 perspective, have the right workplace facilities, toilets, wash basins, welfare facilities workers need, etc., etc. And we've got to provide information and training to our workers for their health and safety duties. Okay, so what do we do? Well, when we do a risk assessment, we've got to look at a number of things that we can try to do to reduce the risk. So wherever there is a risk, we'll automatically do an assessment of risk. And from a hierarchy of control, we've got some options that we can take into consideration. Can we eliminate? Can we reduce or substitute? Can we isolate or engineer out? Can we control, and can we give people PPE, personal protective equipment? Now, PPE is the final resort. Ideally, in a perfect world, we would eliminate, but obviously we need water for various things, various functions, etc., etc. And we can't reduce or substitute water, so unfortunately we are left with water on our sites. We can, however, engineer. We can engineer best practices to be put in place. So, for example, no overstored capacity or reduction in the amount of aerosol generating systems that we've got on site, or try to mitigate any dead legs or low flow areas or infrequently used areas or blind ends. And to ensure that we've got good control through temperature or supplementary control that can actually add to the control procedures in place. But with all of those things in place, we also need a management plan. And we need to assess, first of all, we need to assess the risks to health arising from hazardous substances. So it comes under COSH. So Legionella comes under COSH. We don't do a COSH assessment for it, but we do everything, we do indirectly everything that COSH tells us to do, which is do a risk assessment, give information to employees, ensure competent personnel, put a management plan in place, keep records, and we've got a duty of care to employees and non-employees. We decide what precautions are needed. You must not carry out work which could expose your employees to hazardous substances without first considering the risks and the necessary precautions on what else you need to do to comply with COSH. Prevent or adequately control exposure. You must prevent your employees being exposed to hazardous substances. Where preventing exposure is not reasonably practical, then you must adequately control it. We ensure that control measures are useful or used and maintained properly and that safety procedures are followed. We monitor the exposure of employees to hazardous substances. We carry out appropriate health surveillance where your assessments have shown that this is necessary or where COSH sets specific requirements. And we prepare plans and procedures to deal with accidents, incidents, and emergencies involving hazardous substances where necessary. And finally, we ensure employees are properly informed, trained, and supervised and instructed to a standard and keep that on a rolling program from a refresher training, for example. And this is a lot of words on this slide. And I suppose what we're trying to do here is talk about the various things. So we've got some statute documents. And those statute documents are Health and Safety at Work Act, 1974, Management Health and Safety at Work Regulations, 1999. And we've got COSH. And we've also got one more bit of information from a statute perspective if we look after cooling towers, which is statutory instrument 2225, which is the cooling tower register with the local authority. And then we've got another document, which is the control of Legionella bacteria in water systems and an approved code of practice. And every is not a law. Every approved code of practice has got a special legal status or quasi-legal status. And it's basically a document that tells you how to manage the risk from Legionella bacteria, specifically in your water systems. And the requirement of this is that, as I say, it's a special legal status and it's something that will support the law if you are not achieving what it says or doing something equal to it or better than, and being able to prove that that is the case. So this document has got a special legal status with the approved code of practice and its requirements to have a suitable and sufficient risk assessment completed, and the risk assessment must be completed by a competent person. What is the risk that needs to be assessed? Well, the HSE have come to the conclusion that there are 4 areas, and this is within the documentation. This is within HSG 274, which is the guidance part. So this is the pure guidance aspect. HSG 274 is the pure guidance. The approved code of practice has got that special legal status. And then further ahead of that, we've got the statute documents to Health and Safety at Work Act 1974 and other documents and legislation. But the 4 areas where this has been described as a foreseeable risk are cooling systems with cooling towers, evap condensers or dry wet cooling systems. We've got hot and cold water systems. We've got spa pools, and we've got other plant and systems containing water that can create and increase the risk from Legionella during operation or when being maintained. Now, the first 3 are pretty self-explanatory, but the final one is any other risk system. So any other water system where water surface tension is broken has got the potential for generating an aerosol, which therefore should and could and should be risk assessed during that risk assessment process. And there may well not be any actions on the back of that risk assessment process with that particular aerosol generating system. It might be a closed system, it might not be any risk, etc., etc. There might be nobody there that can contract Legionella disease. But the likelihood is that there's going to be something, whether it's being operated on, being maintained, there may well be an aerosol, and it's up to the site's responsibility or the system owner to identify what those systems are before the risk assessment And the risk assessor should take into consideration how it's operated. They should get the expertise of the people who are using the equipment to make sure that they understand it, how it's managed, how it's being run on a daily basis, and how it's being maintained. So those four things there, it's the catch-all statement at the bottom from the within the HSG 274 document, which means any other risk system. Okay, I would like to add just a quick one there. I know we might have some people from different parts of the world. This is purely based in the UK, so this is just UK legislation, and it may well be in some way or shape or form implemented in other areas. Okay, so we've also got a low risk system. An example of a low risk situation is in a small building without people especially at risk from Legionella bacteria, where daily water usage is inevitable and sufficient to turn over the entire system, and where cold water comes directly from a wholesome main supply, no stored water on site, where hot water is fed from instantaneous heaters or low storage volume water heaters, and where the only outlets are toilets and hand wash basins. However, even a low risk system needs to have a basic risk assessment performed and some form of monitoring regime in place. And I suppose when was the last time we heard about Legionella in the press? Well, the last time I remember it being in the press was the Bibby Stockholm debacle, where a floating hotel was manufactured or made or built, engineered, and we were putting some migrants onto the boat, and instead of testing the ship or the boat before the water system on the boat before the migrants went on, we unfortunately tested it after they'd gone on, and it came to light that Legionella was present on the boat at that particular moment in time, and therefore they had to ship them all back off. And there was a bit of a hoo-ha about it, about how incompetent the government was about doing such a task. And because it's not in the press as often as what I would like it to be, I don't know whether an awful lot of people or lots of people in the world understand it, or maybe have heard about it, but maybe get maybe misinformed. And as I say, because I'm in the industry, I'd like everybody to talk about it and to know about it. But in reality, I think the numbers are still quite low. But the reason why we have to have these Legionella risk assessments is because there is a significant risk. Okay, so what do we mean by significant risk? Risk is the likelihood or probability times the consequence. Now, the good thing is that the likelihood or probability of contracting Legionella disease is low. But the consequence of contracting Legionella disease is, unfortunately, it can be fatal, so therefore death. And there's not many things that are more fatal or more higher consequence than death. And these are the number of cases that have been in the UK since 2019. And we've got, we've got 2016 to 2018 3-year mean, and then we've got a 2019. After 2019, the numbers started to drop off because we had other fish to fry in the world of viruses, and that was COVID. And we've now moved to NOIDS from a collection of data of number of cases within the UK. So this data is slightly older than I would like it to be, but we're looking at maybe introducing more data. Now we've got some more consistent readings from NOIDS, which is part of the Public Health England. And as we can see, the summer months are the more active for Legionella bacteria. Why? Because unfortunately it generates and proliferates within the ranges of 20 to 45 degrees centigrade. So the warmer months tend to increase the proliferation rate of the bacteria. But it's not to say that we don't have any outbreaks as the winter period appears. We do. And unfortunately, one of the things that we also tend to do is we put cold water storage tanks in loft spaces in the summer months. Those cold water storage tanks get hot because loft spaces get hot, and building temperatures, insulation, with all of those things that go on, we are retaining heat a lot easier, more efficiently, and that will therefore have an increase in the temperatures within the water systems within properties. So there is a Legionella risk, and there is a monthly report, as I say, issued by NOIDS, which is part of the Public Health England, and we will improve those figures. Okay, British Standard 20 8580-2019, what does it include? So these are the things that the 8580 document tells us that we need to do. The approved ECOPA-Leighton HSG 274 don't tell that you have to, or don't tell you how to complete the risk assessment. They detail the need to have a suitable and sufficient one completed by a competent person. So this document gives us a bit more meat on the bones. Oh, it might be. Sorry, Sarah. Am I breaking up a little bit? Can everybody hear me? Okay.
You are breaking up a little bit.
Yeah, sorry, you are breaking up a little bit, Pete. You started off okay, and then the last slide, it got a little bit glitchy.
I think
Sarah, did I drop out there?
Yeah, you did. You're back again.
If you want to just share your presentation again, Pete, we can get you back up and running.
Okay, that should be. Are we back in?
Perfect. You're really clear now. So whatever the problem was, it seems to have disappeared.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. Okay, I'll start again. So what should a suitable and sufficient risk assessment include or consider? And as such, risk assessments are no longer a look at the water systems in a property. It's not a condition survey. And over the next few slides, I've taken some of these elements of risk assessments and I'll explain them a little bit further. Okay. So, as I just detailed, it's not a condition survey, and we need to look at each of these as a part of the risk assessment process. So we're going to look at contamination. And Legionella is a naturally occurring organism, and it's in mains water at low concentrations. And how can a water system be contaminated, colonized, nutrients in there to support contamination through low flow or no flow equals a biofilm, for example? And do we accept that our water system that's supplied via whoever one of our utility providers is not a sterile environment? It's got opportunities for biological contamination. We don't actually keep it sealed. It's always there's always potential leaks. We know there's lots of leaks. So it's not a sterile environment. And that's really a key aspect that we've got to take on board. It's that bacteria is going to be omnipresent. It's always going to be there. And then we're going to look at the amplification, the growth of Legionella within the water system. And we need somewhere warm to live with food, and the same is true with Legionella. Yeah, we want some food, some warmth in a house or a home. And then we're going to look at transmission. And water that contains Legionella transmitted to a human through inhalation or aspiration, for example, we've got to breathe in that small droplet of water. Indoors, sprays of water from outlets or devices, and outdoors from larger devices such as cooling towers or water features can travel several hundred meters, up to 5 miles. There's a case in northern France that has suggested that a lady was 8 kilometers away from a site with a Legionella outbreak, and unfortunately this lady contracted Legionella disease, and it was exactly the same strain that was within a 5-mile radius. Okay, so exposure. So we've also got to look at the closer to the source, the more likelihood to be exposed to atomized water that is created in, i.e. a spa pool, for example. You put your head just above the waterline where the aerosols are being generated. And then from a susceptibility perspective, more are susceptible than others, but these need to be considered. So what increases our susceptibility? Age, illnesses, immunocompromised, lung deficiency, smoking, heavy drinking, other types of illnesses such as cancer and kidney failure, for example. They all have an impact on the susceptibility of the individual. And as we just said there, the susceptibility at a school, college, university, for example, can't be the same as susceptibility at a hospital, for example. We've got to take into consideration the occupant susceptibility. And one of the key areas that we're going to look at and what British Standard 8580 focuses on is the competency of the risk assessor. And one of the things that I talk about on a regular basis is just because the person's done a Legionella risk assessment in a domestic dwelling, does that make that person a Legionella expert in a hospital or on a power plant, for example, where we've got these natural draft cooling systems? And I suppose one of the key things there is not just Legionella awareness and Legionella knowledge, but it's also about site-specific knowledge and how they operate and what the requirements are, and also put in the susceptible population. An example is, would you get on a bus if the driver didn't have a license? You need to ensure that the assessor is competent to complete the risk assessment on your type of industry sector. And this is emphasised in the approved code of practice L8, where it says there on section 29, the duty holder must ensure that the person who carries out the risk assessment and provides advice on prevention and control of exposure must be competent to do so. So looking at competency, how do we assess competency? It's not just a case of they've been trained and they're experienced. They might be experienced, but they might be doing it wrong for the last 20 years. And they might have been trained. They might have been trained to a specific, fantastic, fabulous standard, but they may not have paid attention. So how do we do it? We actually assess them for suitability whilst in progress. So the organisations that have risk assessors should be doing a competency assessment and making sure that their information, the documents are being peer reviewed, checked, and sense checked and witnessed, and inspections go on, and appraisals, for example. And then the duty holder must, as I said before, same section, competency, the LCA membership scheme, which the HSE details in the approved code of practice in HSG 274, is a possible source for support. So the LCA is a Legionella Control Association, and they've got a whole myriad of organisations that can produce or perform Legionella risk assessments. But to go one further, to get a company that's got a UCAS accredited that conforms to the British standard 8580, you've got to have a UCAS accreditation, and only 14 of those organisations are on that body. Okay, so what do we do when we're on site? Do we do a desktop appraisal of documentation? So this is really a review of the information that you've got readily available. So when those enforcing organisations come on site, they will ask you for your risk assessment, they will ask you for a water risk policy, they will ask you for your written scheme or water safety plan, and they will ask you for the records. And as long as you can get access to those things and they are readily available, they'll be happy. And one of the most difficult things for a risk assessor to do is to get access to the documentation when they're on site. And this is really key because it's a desktop appraisal of how you're currently managing the risk. And that condition survey that I mentioned earlier at the start is a look at the water systems, some temperatures and notes on status of condition. This is not a risk assessment. In order to assess the risk, you need to consider how the risk is currently being managed. And that is by having that desktop appraisal of the documentation completed as early as possible. And what are we looking for? We're looking for appraisal of the current scheme of control, the maintenance of testing records, management responsibilities, training records and competency checks, safe operation of the system, and monitoring and inspection records and the results. And before looking around the building at the water systems, there is a need to look at the entire management system that drives how Legionella is managed within the organisation or the property. Yeah, if the RP, let's have an example, if the responsible person hasn't had training, how good is their knowledge and understanding of what is required? Yeah, and how do they then pass that information down to the competent personnel and the other people within the business to try and manage the Legionella aspect? Yeah, if it's a poor knowledge at the top end, it's probably going to be a poor knowledge as we go further down towards the users. Okay, and then after the desktop appraisal, there is a need to look at the risk systems within the property. This actually requires the assessor to look at the current asset list and visit that item, device or system and assess it. It's not a drive-by. It's not a cut and paste approach to the risk assessment. We've done it before, quick look at the next survey and we move on. Yeah, if the assessor identifies an imminent danger of exposure to Legionella, failure of a biocide, for example, dosing system, cold or hot water supplies to aerosol generating outlets, such as showers, which are significantly too warm or too cool, respectively, they should report this immediately to the competent person or their site representative and not keep this for the final written report. So imminent dangers are a key aspect of this. This gives you that prior knowledge or pre-knowledge, sorry, this gives you that early warning report to state that you've got some problems and we can have a quick fix, rather than waiting a week or 2 weeks or whatever it is to get your report back. As I said, it's not a drive-by and just a little bit of... Okay, so measurements. Measurements that are routinely taken on site. And temperature control is the traditional control strategy, and it's an excellent tool. So simple takeaways for the day are: keep the hot hot, keep the cold cold, keep it all moving, keep it clean, and keep it well managed. So keeping it hot hot, above 60 degrees C from a stored capacity, above 50 degrees C from a distribution system and return. Keep the cold below 20 degrees C within a minute. Keep the hot, keep the hot 50 degrees C. Keep the cold less than 20 degrees C. We need to monitor temperatures. And the person, for example, the way that we monitor temperatures is really key. And the person completing the routine checks, have they been trained? There are different types of thermometers: immersion, contact, dual gauges, for example, BMS systems. Do they know how to use them correctly and where to record the data? When was the thermometer last checked or calibrated? Yeah, when did we last calibrate the gauges on the vessels, and how reliable is that data? And this data is providing evidence on the state of compliance. If it's not right, then false assurances are provided. And where there is doubt about the efficacy of the thermometer from the desk-based appraisal, the risk assessor will be inclined to take more temperature readings to test the systems to see if it is compliant. Testing for Legionella. So testing for Legionella is not a prerequisite for a Legionella risk assessment. They are included as an extra. Yeah, British Standard 8580 details clearly when a sample might want to be taken as part of the risk assessment. And British Standard 7592 details how to take a Legionella sample pre and post need and technique. And it's key that we follow the British Standard 7592. It's key that we get it to a UCAS accredited laboratory in the right time frame at the right temperature. And it's key that the UCAS accredited laboratory delivers a suite that conforms to ISO 11731. So as I've mentioned, I've gone throughout the day, I've mentioned a lot of British standards, 7592, ISOs, HTML 401. There's lots of documentation that we need to adhere to, but there are specifics, and that's why we have water treatment experts, water hygiene experts like the Water Hygiene Centre. And then finally, we're looking at things like the risk rating. And what should that risk rating include? Well, L8 and British Standard 8580 don't detail a scoring method. Yeah, 8580 details the need for a scoring matrix to be defined and included in the risk assessment. And the risk should not just be defined by the highest risk value or risk issue. A risk matrix needs to consider the contamination, the amplification, the transmission, and the exposure, and taking all of those things into consideration. And as touched on earlier, susceptibility of occupants need to be considered as such, as this will impact on the risk rating. The susceptibility of the individual. And then we're looking at basically the clear and conciseness of that risk assessment. So historically, yeah, we would have in the water hygiene, water treatment world, we would have generated a Legionella risk assessment that included pages and pages and copies and extracts of all of those other documents that I've just formally mentioned or mentioned earlier. And this is to have a document that's not pages and pages of repeating guidance and history of Legionella. Yeah, the first outbreak occurred in 1976. The first major outbreak in the UK was 1985. In 2002, there was a bar outbreak where somebody Gillian Beckingham got personally fined £15,000. There's lots of the information available, but we don't need to include that in a risk assessment. A risk assessment should be clear and concise, should have an action plan, the risk minimisation scheme, and there needs to include a priority status for the recommendations, and the deadlines for the prioritised actions needs to be agreed by the responsible person or the water safety group. How can a risk assessor determine deadlines for an organisation if they don't control the budget? So one of the things that the Water Hygiene Centre and me personally dislike is the fact that organisations like to put deadlines and timeframes on. Now, these are recommendations, but I don't believe that somebody can give a recommendation and expect it to be completed, because again, they haven't got access to budgets. They haven't got 12 months, 6 months, 12 months, 2-year plan or knowledge of the plan. Yes, they can ask, but yeah, how candid is the person who we're asking going to be telling us that that cooling tower might shut down next week, or this part of the plant might be closed down, or we might be relocated? There's lots of things that the risk assessor hasn't got access to, and the risk should be, in my opinion, and water hygiene centres should be determined by the group or the management group within the business. And having completed a broad overview of what the British Standard 8580 requires from a risk assessment, some of the items discussed will and may already have the mind racing. And it'll be worth looking at the content of the British Standard 8580 and completing a check or tick list to see if you comply. And this is a good opportunity to either take a photograph and Sarah, are we sending the deck out? If we do send the deck out, you'll already have it in the standards, but this is a fabulous slide just to take a look at and just to make sure that you guys are having risk assessments that comply with this format.
Just to interject there,
Examples of what's good. Okay, so key points to take away. Legionella risk assessments are a requirement of regulations and guidance. Guidance details what needs to be assessed, it doesn't tell you how. The British Standard 8580-2019 details the approach for undertaking a Legionella risk assessment, what it needs to include. Legionella risk assessments which meet the requirements. Yeah, 8580 version 1 2019. Look to the LCA membership. There's greater than 300 members who can complete them. And for further differentiation, look to UCAS accreditation. And it's now 14 companies in the UK accredited for Legionella risk assessments. Legionella risk assessments to be completed by a competent individual who is independent and vested interest. And that's key. And a key aspect there is independence. So if there is an organisation who is doing a risk assessment for multiple buildings across a portfolio, and the recommendation might be clean and disinfect the tank, okay, and that's a valid recommendation. But from a hierarchy of controls, what could we do that would potentially reduce the risk even further? We could look at removing the tank. Do we actually need the tank to be there? Does the tank, or can the tank be removed? It could be go directly onto mains fed. There's lots and lots of options available to us, but that's why we stress. And that's why the documentation stresses that we need to be independent and we need to take a look at as from a sort of an overarching view of reducing the risk, not just generating cash for the company doing them. Now, hopefully that made a little bit of sense. We are looking to have some further reviews of documentation. HSG 274 Part 1 was reviewed and released late 2024. HSG 274 Part 2, which is hot and cold water systems, is due for a review. It's being reviewed. Communications with the LCA, with members of the Management of Water Safety, Water Management Society, and obviously the HSE will be taking the lead role in it. So fingers crossed that's going to come out in relatively quick time, but don't hold your breath. These things do take a little bit of time. But there's a further updates due shortly. The British Standard 8580 2019, I don't think is going to be reviewed for a number of years. So that will stay as it is for the moment. Okay. Finally, last slide, a little bit of the Water Hygiene Centre. Please feel free to follow us from weekly blogs. If we're looking at the management and control, we've got several senior consultants who write blogs on behalf of clients and people who want to know answers to questions. They are focused on education, and all of our academy videos are online. And as I say, we've got a whole myriad of information available to anybody who wants to take a look at it. Like I say, please follow us from a subscription perspective. And you get a lot of information through which can be of use to you, or it could be of use to your peers. Okay, fabulous. Hopefully that's clarified a few points. Now, shall we open up for questions if anybody has any?
Thanks, Pete. Yes, I've got a few questions that have come in. One is from Gareth Jones. He asks, should the risk assessor identify sentinel points?
Should the risk identify sentinel points?
Yes. Should the risk assessor identify sentinel
Yeah, okay. Great question. The documentation states that the site should know the sentinel points. It's always nice for a risk assessor to confirm them. So the job of the risk assessor is to confirm the sentinel points. If they can, if you've asked them to confirm, if you've asked them as part of the risk assessment proposal to identify the sentinel points, then they would need access to certain things such as P&IDs or as fitted drawings and as much information as you possibly can, and then it would still be a suspicion of this is the sentinel point, without a thorough pipe tracing, which would mean fabric of the building being destroyed. They couldn't guarantee that it was definitely there, but they could give it a best guess or best estimate.
Also from Gareth. Gareth has a couple of questions here. What percentage of people who contract Legionella?
Oh, you're really,
die?
Sarah, I can't hear you very well at all.
Oh, there we go. Is that better?
Oh,
Can
that's
you hear
better.
me?
That's better.
Can you hear me now? Sorry, it was my mouthpiece on my headset had dislodged itself. Okay, another question from Gareth. What percentage of people who contract Legionnaire's disease die? I believe it to be actually quite low in comparison to mesothelioma, for example, 100% and many thousands per year.
Okay, great question. So the contraction rate is on average 1%. So however many people are exposed to Legionella bacteria, 1% of the population will exhibit symptoms on average. Of that 1%, there's a 12% fatality rate. Now, back in 1976, 29 people died at the Bellevue Stratford hotel outbreak. I think it was 27 people in Stafford in 1985. There was 7 people in Barrow-in-Furness, and there was 4 people in Edinburgh. I think those were the numbers. As we can tell there, there was 2 people in 2012 also, just by the way, in Stoke-on-Trent, Fenton in Stoke-on-Trent, who unfortunately were passing a spa pool, a jacuzzi bath that was on display in a facility, and 2 people contracted Legionella disease from an inhalation of the aerosols being released from a spa pool in a shop used as a demonstration purposes. So with the significant numbers, hopefully that's answered that question.
Thanks, Pete. Next one, another one from Gareth. What is the correct priority order of control methods? Clean, temp, and then movement. Movement is the movement for me. Movement, temperature, then clean. Okay. Movement, temperature, and then clean. Okay. Hopefully.
Yeah, so stagnation is one of the main causes. So if we can get it moving, it's not got a chance to find a house or a home. So if the faster it goes through the process, it's got no place for it to sit and start to proliferate. The temperature, if it's less than 20, it's deemed as being dormant. If it's over 45, it's starting to being killed. 50 degrees C, I think it can last for a couple of hours. 60 degrees C, a couple of minutes. So temperature either end is really good, and then keep the system clean and then cleaning. So irrespective, we've got to get the water moving and the temperature in the right locations, and then, in my opinion, it's movement, temperature, cleaning. If we're putting those 3 things in a list, priority.
Okay, excellent, super. A question here from Ray West. Air source heat pumps are becoming a concern for many of his clients, as plus 50 degrees C temperatures at sentinel points and hot feed to TMVs do not appear to be designed to achieve the 50 degrees centigrade or more. They purge at 65 to 75 degrees centigrade on a daily basis, and this temperature is circulated, but still leaves a high-risk pipework where correct temperature monitoring cannot be achieved in accordance with requirements. Legislation and guidance does not appear to have caught up with this modern type of system. What is the current requirement and expectation for achieving outlet temperatures where air source heat pumps are installed, please?
A great question. There isn't any. So it falls back in line with what we should be doing from an approved code of practice and HSG 274 perspective. You're absolutely right. From air source, from ground source, the temperatures are not being achieved. So options would be supplementary control measures, additional things, additional tools, additional chemistry, additional disinfection processes. But you're absolutely right. I genuinely do not know whether the revision of the HSG 274 Part 2 will take that into consideration either. I don't know at this moment in time.
Have we got any dates on when that's going to be released? I don't think we do as yet, do we?
No, we don't, unfortunately. No,
it's
no.
Still. Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay. Another question here. Does the Legionella risk assessment extend beyond water utility to every hospitality sector to include off licenses?
Okay, so 5 or more employees, or we're serving water to, or water is being offered to the general public, if that makes sense. So
Okay.
hospitality sector everywhere pretty much is needing a Legionella risk assessment to some form.
If you have 5 or more employees.
Yeah,
What you're
and you're
saying,
providing water to the public.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic. I think that, just double check, I think that was, there's another question here actually. Someone who doesn't have access to the standard, is there a good source of the requirements set down in the standard that is publicly available?
So the approved code of practice, the ACOP L8, is free to download now from the HSE website. That's used to cost £8. If you just type in HSE website and then find Legionella control or the approved code of practice L8, then it will just pop up and you should be able to download it for free. And then also on the same website, there'll be HSG 274 Part 1, Part 2, and Part 3 that you can download for free as well.
Excellent. Okay, fantastic. So
And those two documents are really key.
So I'm not sure who asked this question because it came up as anonymous, but I have answered with a link to the ACOP L8 and HSG 274 blog that we have. And within that blog on our website, there is a link that will take you to the ACOP L8 webpage for you to download the guidance for free.
Cool.
Is there any more questions? Here we go. Here's one from Philip McGarry. Would a typical risk assessment for Part 2 systems detail Part 1 or Part 3 systems, or would they just detail up to these and recommend a separate, more specialized risk assessment?
Okay, so if you had so Part 1 is for cooling towers and evap condensers, then Part 2 is predominantly based on the hot and cold water systems, and Part 3 is based on any other risk system, any other process system that is within the facility. If you go for a full risk assessment and you've identified certain things, so if you've got a cooling tower or a evap condenser, then Part 1 would be included. That would be included, but it would be linked towards Part 1. And then your domestic hot and cold system would be in your risk assessment, but linked to the recommendations within Part 2. And if you've got any other water risk system, like fire suppression system or emergency showers or deluge systems, for example, then that would be under Part 3. If you asked a risk assessment organisation to deliver a risk assessment and you told them what pieces of kit you've got on site or what you think you've got on site, as much as you possibly can, then they'll come to you with a risk assessment that would cover the relevant sections within Part 1, 2, and 3. Hopefully I've made that clear.
Excellent. Thank you, Pete. I've just got a blog here actually that talks about risk assessments and the guidance. So I shall just pop that in there for you, Philip, if you wanted to take a look. Here's a question from Richard Porter. Should HVAC AHUs be part of the risk assessment? Did you get that, Pete?
If it's included within the scope, it's a question that you'd need to ask the risk assessment company that they've got expertise in delivering AHU risk assessments.
I've got, Richard, if it's of use to you, we do have a blog actually that talks about drain traps on air handling units. I don't know if that would maybe help, but I'll pop that in the chat if you wanted to take a look. Let's have a look. I think if we've got anything else. Does anybody else have any further questions?
can't see anything else, Sarah, can you?
No, I think I've just about covered everything. If I haven't, please do speak up, and we'll get to your question. I think I've just about covered everything.
Thank you, Sarah. So thank you,
oh.
Pete, for an excellent presentation. And thank you, Sarah, for providing all the excellent information and managing the questions. We really do appreciate you giving up your valuable time for us today. And I can see there's a question just popped in. We'll answer this last one, and then we'll come to a close.
Okay, let me have a look.
Oh, it's just a compliment,
thank
actually.
You. Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you for clearing some questions up. There's some bits I wasn't too sure, but now it's all making much clearer. Thank you very much. That's great. That's from Oliver. So I think.
Excellent, thank you.
That's
Just
it,
to
Julie.
remind everyone that the recording will be uploaded onto the IIRSM member resource hub, and I'll post the link on on the East Anglia branch WhatsApp group and on their LinkedIn page. So thank you very much for attending. We really do appreciate you attending our webinar this afternoon. Again, Pete, Sarah, thank you so much. We really do appreciate it. And I would like to wish everyone a good afternoon or evening, wherever you are in the world.
Thanks, Julie.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
all.
Bye-bye.